In today's video, we're checking out a pair of the Sirui Sniper lenses. I have the 16mm F1.2 and the 75mm F1.2. These are both dedicated APS-C lenses for the E, X or Z mount, and they can produce a crazy amount of shallow depth of field. While these lenses aren't clinical in their look or feel, they're very impressive and they'll give you a great look in most shooting situations. I have the E Mount version of these lenses on hand, and all of these samples were shot using my Sony FX30. Let's get into it. Welcome back, folks. My name's Shane. Rather than bore you with test charts, specs, and graphs, I wanted to talk about the pros and cons of these two Sirui Sniper lenses from a hands-on capacity. There's already plenty of specification reviews regarding these lenses on YouTube, so I wanted to focus on how these lenses perform for shooting video in combination with my Sony FX30 that's shooting this shot over here. I'm going to talk about what considerations also need to be made if you plan on shooting video wide open at f1.2, especially outdoors. Before we get into the test samples and review, a huge thank you to Sirui for sending these out to the channel. I really appreciate it. This is why it says paid promotion somewhere on screen. As always though, all thoughts about these lenses are my own, and it's not being influenced by Sirui in any way. Alright, let's talk about this dual lens pack that Sirui sent out. So we get a 16mm f1.2, and with that 1.5 times APS-C crop, you get that classic 24mm full frame equivalent. We also get this beautiful 75mm f1.2. Now this translates out to 112.5mm, which makes this one of the tightest prime lenses I've ever used when it comes to its focal length, but it renders some really beautiful results. For those unfamiliar with the difference in focal length between 16mm and 75mm, here's a photo shot at 16mm, and here's the same framing at 75mm. As you can see, it's much tighter with the 75mm, which means for shooting video or interviews, for example, you'll need to have the camera quite a long way back. Let's talk about the aperture of these lenses and the shooting experience. So f1.2 is insanely fast, and if you plan on shooting at the minimum aperture, you'll need ND filters. f1.2 is over a full stop faster than f1.8, meaning you only need half the amount of light as f1.8. If you plan on shooting wide open outside, bring some ND filters with you. There's no way around this. In low light situations or controlled studio situations like this, you should be fine without them. But shooting outside, even on an overcast day, you'll definitely need to use some NDs, as I did. f1.2 completely maxed out the shutter speed on my Sony FX30 at 8,000 straight away, so there's no way around that. The look of these two lenses on a Sony APS-C camera will rival the look found on full frame cameras shooting at an f1.8, so if that's important to you, these are a really great choice. If you've already got an ND filter, the interesting thing with both of these is the filter threads are slightly different sizes. So we get a 58mm on the 16 and a 67mm on the 75. This 24mm equivalent lens is a great focal length for general wide angle shooting without being too wide or tight. Paired with my Sony FX30, I was able to get pretty solid handheld results with a camera that's got pretty average in-body image stabilization. This Sirui Sniper 16mm f1.2 will give you more background blur than the closest lens I had in my collection, which is the Sony 15mm f1.4, and this only costs a fraction of the price of the Sony. We'll talk more about value and how these compare against other lenses a little bit later on. One of the downsides to the 16mm f1.2 is its autofocus performance. If you're wondering, is the autofocus better or as good as the Sony 15mm f1.4? The quick answer is no. The Sony lens is more reliable when it comes to autofocus, but the image out of the Sirui objectively looks better. So it's a tough choice. While the autofocus with the 16mm works, it sometimes struggles pulling focus smoothly, especially if there's something faster moving in the frame. You can see from this example, there's a lot of pulsing in the background and the focus is ramping quite a lot. The Sony lens doesn't have this issue whatsoever. I also noticed some inconsistencies when it came to this lens in a product showcase scenario, so just holding something up to the camera. I found that occasionally it would just glitch and start pulsing between me, the lens, or the background, and it just does it at random. It didn't happen that often, but it's definitely worth pointing out. I'm hoping that this can be addressed in a future firmware update. Now, with all of that said, overall, the autofocus works okay. If you're just doing basic vlogging or follow shots, for example, and someone's not zooming in and out of the frame and all that kind of stuff, it actually works pretty well, enough to trust it. But keep the speed and sensitivity on your camera at or under 4 for the most reliable autofocus. Another reason why both of these lenses are great for video is we get extremely low focus breathing, which is very impressive. While the minimum focus isn't that impressive on both lenses, if you need to get in close, the 75mm is definitely the way to go. A lot of fast lenses I've tested tend to suffer from a lot of chromatic aberration, but in my test samples, I didn't find this to be a problem either. This 16mm lens is not quite as sharp as my Sony 15mm lens, at least wide open, but with that in mind, shooting on my Sony FX30, which is an inherently sharp sensor or image, you can see how the Sirui actually softens out my beard and lines on my skin, which is a good thing for me, at least at my age anyway. Now let's talk about this 75mm F1.2. This is arguably the most impressive prime I've seen in a long time. The image quality coming out of this lens is excellent. If you're a video shooter or want a prime, this 112mm field of view is an absolute no-brainer. The background blur, compression, subject separation are all off the charts, and I'm very impressed with the end result, even when shooting wide open at f1.2. While the autofocus isn't great on the 16mm f1.2, the great news is the autofocus on the 75mm feels like a Sony native lens. This performs really well. It's nice and smooth. It doesn't have any sort of jarring motion or flicker in the image. I used this for quite a number of hours outside, and this was by far the most reliable out of the two. Again, this could just be a firmware update thing that fixes the 16, but as it stands right now, this 75mm f1.2 works beautifully. The bokeh balls on both of these lenses look beautiful, and if you love large round bokeh, or bokeh, however you say it, you'll dig this lens. The only downside to the 75mm f1.2 is that it's really hard to get decent handheld shots paired with my Sony FX30. If you have the new A6700 with the new digital image stabilization system, you should be fine, but on the FX30, it's tough to get rid of the micro jitters even with active steady shot on. Remember, this is not an issue with the lens, but with the IBIS system on the camera. I consider this 75mm f1.2 a tripod or gimbal lens only for my video use cases, and in those scenarios, it looks absolutely beautiful. The 75mm is a beautiful lens, and while it does suffer from flaring, I really do like the look of it, and I would have no problems using this for my personal projects, interviews, or anytime I need excellent low light performance on my Sony FX30. Let's cover the design of these lenses and how they feel to use. So you might have noticed already, the only feature on this lens is a focus ring, and that is it. And it is focused by wire, but the focus ring really does feel great. And I had no trouble pulling focus manually in my tests. One of the glaring omissions on these lenses though is there's no autofocus manual focus switch anywhere. And I'm so used to using that. Sure, it's not a deal breaker by any stretch of the imagination, but it's something I got used to having on my other lenses, and going to a lens that doesn't have an autofocus manual focus switch was a little bit of a bummer. Comparing it to the Sony 15mm f1.4, you're getting a lot of premium features on this lens. This lens has an aperture ring, we get an autofocus manual focus button, and also a dedicated function button, whereas you only get a focus ring on the Sirui, but the focus ring on the Sirui is every bit as nice as the one on the Sony. So if you do need to pull focus manually, you can map that to a button on your camera like I have. I've got the joystick mapped to autofocus manual focus, and then you can simply use this. So it's a very nice lens. It's just very simple in its design. All right, let's talk about who these lenses are for. So unlike the Sirui anamorphic lens or the Nightwalker series, which have a very particular use case, they're used for shooting video, these appear to be good for both video and photographic purposes. Now, when it comes to its video autofocus, the 16mm definitely needs a firmware upgrade. I would have a hard time recommending this over the 15mm if you were looking for the best in autofocus. There's also a 16mm Sigma lens out there as well, which is f1.4. Now, I don't own that. I know people that do own it. The autofocus, even on the Sony FX30, is quite good on that as well. So weigh up the difference in the price, and you can pick the best one for the job. With that in mind though, this 75mm F1.2 goes in the best of 2024. I love the look of this lens, and if you're a video shooter and you're happy using it on a tripod or a gimbal, you're gonna love it. I think the image coming out of this is every bit as good as far more expensive lenses. Now let's talk about build quality and design. I'm a huge fan of lenses that look like they're part of a set. This is why I'm a big fan of the Lumix S series of lenses. They all look the same and you can tell they're part of the same series. These get the big thumbs up as well. They're only a hair difference in terms of size, but they share all of the same aesthetic elements. So you can tell instantly that they're part of the same set. Now, my only nitpick when it comes to the lens hoods here is that they sort of fray on the inside. The more you put them on and off, the more you'll see black pieces of plastic fall off. Now, they actually lock in pretty well once you get them locked in, but you'll notice as you take them on and off a few times that the plastic on the inside will actually start to come off. So I don't know if that's going to cause problems long term. Eventually, it'll probably just wear itself down to the point where it doesn't do it anymore, but it's definitely worth mentioning. Given that these Sirui Sniper lenses are $300 to $400 cheaper than the first-party Sony lenses, they represent excellent value for money. Now, with the autofocus bug aside on the 16mm lens, if you're not pushing this too hard, it will do the job fine, but just know it's a little more unpredictable than I'm used to, especially shooting with a Sony camera. At the end of the day, it's great to see Sirui doing some autofocus lenses for those folks who can appreciate the experience of not having to manually focus. Thanks again for watching. My name's Shane. I'll catch you on the next one. See ya.